Well, good evening. It's great fun to be here. I mean, I wonder whether I'm actually always doomed to be following Peter Mandelson. I mean, I had some encounters with Mandy several years ago when, for a very brief, hilarious, and catastrophically funny moment, I was creative director of the Millennium Dome until I fell out with Mandy. And I remember when he came in, this is actually before Blackberries, when he still had pages, and I remember Mandy trotting into the to a meeting of all the Millennium Committee with his pager bleeping and a little retinue of caterpillar-like followers behind him. And he wanted to, I remember now vividly, this is not what I want to talk about, it's an irresistible anecdote though. He wanted to calm the nerves of the Millennium Dome staff, because it was the new Blair Dawn and they had to make a decision about whether they were going to go ahead with it. And I was just, as usual, just sitting at the back insolently by myself because I wasn't actually employed, I was just a consultant to the whole project. Everybody's very, very restive. And Mandy said, in his magnificent pomp, he said, "Rest assured, young people, I believe in art, design, and excellence. However, I am a politician." And so then I said that, I suppose that means there are times when you don't believe in art, design, and excellence then. And they tell me it took minutes for or perhaps hours for the children to leave the room. And that was the end of me and my relationship with the great man. Apart from one little exchange we had, Mandy dismissed me as a whining elitist, which might or might not be true. And he said, "We're spending £750 million on this thing in Docklands. How could you be critical of it?" And I said, "Well, you could actually buy £750 million worth of horse shit, and it would be impressive, but you'd have to ask yourself, would it actually be worth doing?" And I'm afraid he didn't really have an answer for that. I mean, as Hannah said, he's a man of the most extraordinary intelligence and occasionally of charm, but like most politicians, actually doesn't see. And look, what I'm going to talk about tonight is just, I think, seeing things. And I'm going to be very, very brief because everybody's overrun and I want to go home and all of you want to go home too. I've completely misunderstood the brief, not for the first time in my life. And I ended up talking about cars, which, I mean, only a criminal psychotic would be interested in cars at one level. I wouldn't mind if I never drove again. But I find these things absolutely fascinating. Alex, can we have the Cadillac picture, please? I was at the auction last night, or perhaps it was the night before. I've been travelling this week, so I don't scarcely know where I am, why the Gothic horror of this place is so disturbing me. And I was at the auction of the James Bond's Aston Martin DB5 in Battersea Park. But I wasn't so much interested in that. What I saw, what else was being auctioned there, was a really cruddy 1980s American Buick ENX. I mean, the thing no one in their right mind would care about. But this is the sort of car which you'd go outside a girls' school in, and you'd blip the throttle and make the exhaust roar, and you'd squeal, you'd burn the tires. And this, an American explained to me, making these noises, I mean, the blipping of the throttle and the burning of the tires, this is known as the mating call of the arsehole. And this is not a lovely thing, but it sort of fascinates me. We're looking here at a 1959 Cadillac, the most extreme and gross machine ever made. It fascinates me. There are no justifications for it. This is an undrivable, ungovernable 2.5-ton atmosphere-destroying obscenity. But it fascinates me because I think in a world in which something like this was possible, and it's within the memories of a lot of people in this room, I just think, if that was possible, almost anything was. I mean, what fascinates me perhaps ultimately about the motor car is something which Henry Ford said. Henry Ford, the Germans invented the technology of the motor car, but it's Henry Ford who realized its cultural and social possibilities. Henry Ford said, "I had to invent the gasoline buggy," as he called it. "I had to invent the gasoline buggy in order to escape from the mind-crushing tedium of life on a Midwest farm." And that, in a sense, is what we're all doing. And back to the idea of sort of what makes us passionate about this. I love cars as symbols, and most of all, I'm absolutely fascinated by the erotic content of cars. And I have a terribly, terribly embarrassing anecdote to tell now. I think it's in the spirit of the evening. One must, reveal one's weak sides. Years and years ago, when I was a very, very, an even more miserable and poor person than I am now, and I was a university teacher. And I was driving a cruddy old Citroen, and I was having a most unwise dalliance with a married woman whose very wealthy husband had travelled a lot, and I spent a lot of time with her, and she was very friendly, and I thought this was terrific fun. And he had a terrific car, and I just had this old Citroën crap heap. And I just remember so vividly one day this woman saying to me, and he had, I can't remember what it was, a Jaguar or a Mercedes or something. And she said, "Why don't you take Toby?" He was probably his name. She said, "Why don't you take Toby's car, while he's away?" And I'd been enjoying this woman's company for several evenings. And I remember saying to her, completely unselfconscious, I said, "What? Take his car without asking him?" And I just felt that was in somehow... It's not just me. There are a lot of other, the great artists of the 20th century have also been obsessed by, by motor cars. Francis Picabia, the great Dadaist surrealist, he used to disassemble motor instruction manuals for motor cars and label them with, the big ends with sort of, with sexually alluring metaphors. John Steinbeck said that, Frank, thanks to back to Henry Ford, more Americans knew about the electrical coil than knew about the clitoris, and that was in 1927. Okay, next slide, please, Alex. Cars, I said, mean liberation. When I was a kid, most cars were named after Tweedy university cities like Oxford and Cambridge. But then, next slide, Alex, we had a car named after Cortina d'Ampezzo and the Dolomites, which was the home, I think, of the 1960 Winter Olympics. And the brochure, which they sold, this was my first car, by the way, this 1965 or something, Cortina, not that actual one, but something very, very like that. I remember that the brochure of this car, it showed, this was the first generation which experienced jet travel. The brochure had passport stamps in it. It represented a whole world, of fabulous, fabulous opportunity. And this car, it was a terrible machine, and as far as machines was concerned. But I remember vividly, it had a sort of bench seat in the front, which again, for those of amorous intent, it was terrible at driving, but terribly, terribly useful for what you might call the drive-in. But there's a connection. There's a fascinating connection between the very, very suburban Dagenham Ford Cortina and this. The next slide, please, Alex. And this, the Ford Edsel. The Ford Edsel is perhaps the greatest commercial catastrophe ever to happen to American business. And the interesting thing was it was researched, market researched until they thought the Ford of 1958 it came out, and they thought they'd got it absolutely right. And it was a complete lemon turkey, whatever, choose your metaphor. And Ford was mystified. They'd spent more money on the Ford Edsel than any other car. The more market research and consumer motivational research, they'd gone into this than anything else, and it was a complete flop. And what they did, they got some consumers into clinics afterwards, and they put them under hypnosis and tried to understand exactly why no one wanted to buy this car. And the results turned out that, forgive me, but we're being frank, and it's late in the evening, we've all had a glass of wine. The results turned out that the radiator grille of the Ford Edsel here reminded a lot of the co-respondents in the research of a vagina. I'm serious. And there's this terrible prospect. Talk about the sexual symbolism in cars. This terrible prospect of this chromium-plated vagina rushing towards you at 55 miles an hour down the freeway. But anyway, the point is, the person responsible for the design of this car was a jazz musician called Roy Brown Jr., who worked briefly for Ford. And because he was punished for the car's commercial failure by being sent to Dagenham, down the road, where, of course, the next car he drew was the amazingly successful Ford Cortina, Britain's most successful product. The next slide, please, Alex. There is, here we are, Jaguar, the sexual symbolism in motor cars. Here we have the completely phallomorphic Jaguar E-Type. Remember that it is just a phallus. But interestingly, it's a phallus with sort of feminine details. And of course, this car, cars always articulate the sensibilities of the period. Remember, this car appeared at almost exactly the same time as the Mini. Very, very different, but each in their own way betokened the extraordinary social, cultural, sexual liberation of England in the 1960s. Remember the Mini car, 1959, 2 years before this, the Mini car predicted the mini skirt by at least 2 years. Next, please, slide, please. Here we have a truly grotesque picture. If cars represent the erotic instinct, eros, they also represent, to an extent, thanatos, the idea of death. And I'm very fascinated by the way that great car crashes, whether it's Jane Mansfield or Diana or whatever, have helped create not just the reputations of the people who crashed, the celebrities, but also the reputations of the car. This is James Dean's, the remains of James Dean's Porsche in the California desert, where he crashed in 1955, having, with absolute poetry, collided with a Ford pickup truck driven by somebody called Donald Turnipseed. James Dean had put James Dean, the ultimate rebel, of course, had a little bastard painted on the tail of this car. And this has helped this hugely well-publicized incident helped create Porsche's reputation for making dangerous, fast, exciting, motor cars. And after the crash, in sort of full recognition of the sort of almost medieval occult value of the wreckage here, the parts of this car were taken around schools and colleges in the United States in order to deter children from the path of celebrity and speeding. Next slide, please, Alex. The way in which cars articulate this sort of collective view, cars aren't art, but I think in a sense they've usurped art in the way that they represent our collective values. The Beach Boys have always fascinated me. We'll have fun till our daddy takes the T-Bird, i.e. Ford Thunderbird, away, but they haven't sort of Ford Thunderbird here. It's a Chevrolet Corvette and a Pontiac GTO. But again, there's something extraordinarily elegiac about this and the Beach Boys and their appeal to cars. The Beach Boys presented to us in England this vision of Californian perfection, of suntanned, ripped and toned people, on Venice Beach or whatever. They actually weren't from there. The Beach Boys were from working class district in San Diego. The image of California, which they projected in their album sleeves and their music, was at least as much an object for distant yearning for them as it was for us. Next slide, Alex. Dagmar was a famous American television presenter of the 1950s, known as doesn't take me to interpret the photograph for you. She was very well known because of her astonishing features. Next slide, Alex. And these, I'm serious, I'm not joking. These became known in Detroit as Dagmars because Dagmar, one of the first television presenters, she donated all sorts of things, but including this fabulous detail to the motor industry. Now, this is not, next slide, please, Alex. Well, this is not just me sort of fantasizing obscenely about. I wrote a book last year called Woman as Design, and I was on Woman's Hour with a terrible, frazzled old harridan who said, "The problem is you see sex everywhere, Stephen." And I muttered under my breath, "Well, I don't see much in you." But there is sex everywhere. The Romanesque church, and here's a plan of a Romanesque. It's not just me fantasizing about cars and my adult imaginative life. The Romanesque church, many archaeologists, many antiquarians believe is actually a plan of the female reproductive system. The porch, the nave and the chancel are a diagram of the labia, the birth channel, and the ovaries. So it said. Equally, the nave, obviously from the Latin word navis for ship, it's the ship of fools. It's the vehicle which is carrying people towards heaven. It confirms this the fundamental thing in human affairs, which identifies transport, in this case a ship or a church, with something sexual. Next slide, Alex. There's architects and designers throughout this century have been at one conscious level or another totally almost obsessed with female form. These are just a couple of works which I just chose at random by a fabulous Italian sort of necromancer, seducer, liar, card sharp, cheat, pornographer and designer called Carlo Molino, who spent a lot of time taking Polaroid photographs of Turin's Beaumont. You can see one up there, and her details got passed into the cars he made. Next slide, Alex. And into the furniture he made. And have we got another slide? I don't know what's happening next. Oh, this is the next story. The Carlo Molino is only one of several examples of how the female form has influenced and inspired both in the occult sense and in the absolutely obvious sense. Great architecture, great design. Okay, I'm nearly done. Volkswagen. 25 years ago, I wrote a little book called Sex, Drink and Fast Cars. That happened because my publisher took me out to lunch and said, "For God's sake, Stephen, haven't you written enough about design? What's really interesting you?" And I said, "Well, since you are Sex, Drink and Fast Cars." He said, "Well, do it." And this book became, it had modest success in its day, but it gave rise to a fabulously curious correspondence with a man in Kansas who sent me photographs of himself with his pet lion on a lead. And his question was, "Do you like Volkswagens?" And I wrote back to him. This is 1986, long before email or the rest of it. Fax was even primitive then. And I said, well, I'm very interested in the design of Dr. Ferdinand Porsche, the great German-Austrian engineer. And he wrote back again. He said, no. Do you really like Volkswagens? And then my secretary they came in with another bit of correspondence, holding it like this, like a rat on the end of a stick. This man sent photographic evidence of the fact he could only experience sexual gratification by congress with his Volkswagen car. But anyway, next slide. And this is actually the last one. Roland Barthes, one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, got it right, absolutely right about motor cars. He wrote a fabulous essay about the new Citroën in 1957 in his collection of essays called Mythologies. And he said, cars today are our cathedrals, which is to say that they are they're made by anonymous craftsmen and masterpieces, but they're recognized everywhere for their extraordinary symbolic force. But even better than Roland Barthes is here, my old mate, Tom Wolfe, the man who actually does wear blue suede shoes, sitting and enjoying a car. And it was Tom Wolfe who recognized in his first great book, the Tangerine Supercharged, Turbocharged, Streamlane, Candy Flake Baby, or whatever it was called. He said this: cars for the kids today have exactly the same authority that architecture had in Europeans' great age of the 18th century. He said cars are freedom, style, sex, power, motion, color, everything. And I think he was actually right. The great adventure of the modern age is the romance of the machine, and a relationship with a car allows you to take that romance to the point of intimacy. I have to confess, I've been to the Palladio villas on the Brenta Canal. I've seen the Japanese temples in Nara. I've been, wherever I've been to Chartres. I've seen the great cathedrals. Nothing would amuse me more than driving home now in a version of James Dean's Porsche, 550 Rennsport Kurzheck. But then, some sad old bastard, as Peter Mandelson knows. Anyway, thank you and good night.